Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Sir John Kay, one of the most original economic thinkers. He's an economist, writer, and a long-time columnist for the Financial Times. He has taught at Oxford University and London Business School, advised governments and regulators, and chaired the influential Kay Review of UK equity markets, which in a nutshell examined how short-term incentives in finance were damaging long-term investment. He was knighted for his services to economics, and his latest book, The Corporation in the 21st Century, makes a deliberately provocative claim that almost everything we are told about business is wrong. In it, he challenges some of the most deeply held assumptions of modern capitalism about profit, efficiency, shareholder value, and what corporations actually do in the economy. Thank you very much, Sir John, for joining me for the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. And why almost everything we are told about business is wrong? When was the first time in your illustrious career, back in the day perhaps, when you started scratching your head and said, something that I see happening in the real world is nothing close to what I was taught as a student?
It's an interesting observation, that. And it goes back, I think, to the 1990s, when I first started getting involved with business in a practical way, talking to people in big companies and interviewing people in these companies about what they did.
Right.
And there were two or three kind of light bulb moments. But one, I started saying to myself, these people aren't really maximizing profits. And then I said, so what are they maximizing? So that's what you're trained to do as an economist. You write an equation in which people are maximizing something. And then I came to think, actually, they're not maximizing anything. What people who are in senior positions in large companies are doing is trying to cope with an uncertain and changing environment that they only rather imperfectly understand. And that kind of rethinking has been fundamental to what I've thought about both economics and business ever since.
Right. Interesting you say that, because growing up, my mom, dad, teachers would talk about, your goal in life should be to chase your passion, find it, pursue meaning. And then in college, we had a subject where, as part of our curriculum, where it talked about if you are a company, then your singular goal is to maximize shareholder value or maximize profits. And it didn't matter what you did. So that was a bit of an irony at the time, is what I felt. As you know, when it comes to an individual, you have to chase meaning, but if you're a company, you suddenly forget the meaning bit.
Yes,
Or
I think you've hit on an important issue there, which is that there isn't a separation in my mind between ethics and morality as applied to business and ethics and morality as applied to life. They're one and the same. And they couldn't intelligently be otherwise. But people have claimed and pretended and acted to a degree as if they are. I mean, I think a funny example of that is the one with which I begin the book, which is Goldman Sachs, which has an ethics statement that says our clients' interests always come first. The story of that, which is entertaining in a way, is that Goldman Sachs was sued, a class action of US pension funds led by Arkansas teachers and a number of others. And the basis of the action was that they had been misled by this ethics statement, our clients' interests always come first, into thinking that Goldman Sachs was the kind of reputable company in which Arkansas teachers should invest their life savings. What's absurd and interesting about this story is Goldman Sachs' defense to this, which is not to say it's true, we do put our clients' interests first, and here are examples of how we sacrificed profits in order to serve our clients' interests better. They said that the statement is so obviously not true that Arkansas teachers couldn't possibly have been misled by reading it. And what makes the story worse is that ultimately went to the Supreme Court in the United States, and which concluded that we sent it back to the lower court with a clear indication that the lower court should dismiss the case, which they did. The American Chamber of Commerce said this is an example of a generic statement. All companies make statements of this kind, which indeed they do. But
Right.
apparently there would be a problem if they were actually expected to act on it. I mean, all this is nonsense, of course. I have always been struck by, I think it was Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, who famously said, "I can't behave one way at home and another in town." And that's how I think it's got to be. And another light bulb moment for me, actually, was reading a book by Bob Solomon, who rather improbably was professor of moral philosophy at the University of Texas, which is not immediately where you would go to think of useful morality. But he explained business ethics and business morality in Aristotelian terms, in terms of virtue ethics, that actually what you behave, how you behave, is a product of how you are. And I think that's how things have got to be. There's a bishop who said quite a long time ago, honesty may be the best policy, but the man who adopts that policy is not an honest man. And I think that illustrates it very well, as the Goldman ethics statement said. As real honesty is being honest. It is not saying honesty is the best policy until maybe tomorrow it's not the best policy.
Indeed. So it's you also compare it with Red Bull, that if famously or infamously said Red Bull gives you wings, and there was a there was a bit of a commotion around it, where I don't know if somebody sued the company or maybe that was blown out of
Yes,
proportion.
somebody did sue the company, and obviously Red Bull does not give you wing, and everyone knows that.
Right.
And that was actually the Goldman Sachs argument in the case which I'm describing, that our clients' interests do not come first, our profits come first. And that's the reality.
Right, but the statement sounds good on a PowerPoint slide, or maybe when you put them out there, for people to read. But that doesn't mean you have to take it literally, is what Goldman Sachs argued.
And when you talk about a PowerPoint slide, I now actually have a PowerPoint slide that has the introduction to the Goldman Sachs Ethics Code by David Solomon, who is the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And this goes on for a page and a half of drivel about client interests always come first. And actually, it would suit the style of Goldman Sachs, I think. It ended by saying, and if anyone is actually still reading this, here's $100.
So that's it. And are there some companies that, Sir John, struck you in the last 10 or 20 years, say, I'm expanding the time frame, which did something right? I remember watching a documentary back when I was in college. It was about Google. And one of the presenter was saying that Google went to Cleaner Perkins or one of these Silicon Valley outfits, and they showed what they had to offer. And the venture capitalist said that, hey, you guys are making meaning. Now it's our job to figure out how to make money for you, but please continue what you're doing. Is that the right way of approaching things? Because those founders didn't know where the money will come from.
I mean, that's the way in which money is made. People create great businesses, and great businesses make money. And that's exemplified over and over again. The stories I tell now, there are just so many of them. I talk in the book a bit, I think, about ICI, which was Britain's leading industrial company for most of the 20th. And ICI's mission statement said, for most of that time, ICI's purpose is the responsible application of chemistry and related science to business. And that's what they said that the company is about. And it began as a business in dyestuffs and explosives. It moved into petrochemicals and fertilizers. These were new applications of chemistry. And finally, it moved into textiles and, above all, pharmaceuticals, thinking that was a great application of chemistry to business, as indeed it proved to be. But actually, ICI in the early 90s changed its mission statement. it became our purpose is to create shareholder value by focusing on businesses in which we have cost leadership and a competitive advantage. This has been, for me, a story that has kept on giving, because I first gave that as an example way back in the 1990s as to what was going wrong. But I can now put that on a graph of what happened to shareholder value. And the share price reached a peak in 1997. It declined steadily after that. And in 2007, ICI ceased to exist as an independent company. Now, the staggering thing about this is I can tell this story over and over again. I can tell the same story about GEC, the electrical company, which was Britain's second largest industrial company in 1990. And it's the same story, a shift from electricals to shareholder value, and the company no longer exists.
And shareholder value, in your book also has a little cartoon where somebody's at the pearly gates after having died, and the priest or whoever greets him at the pearly gates says, maximizing shareholder value doesn't count.
Yes. No, I put it another way from time to time. No one has an epitaph on their grave that said he maximized shareholder value.
Yeah, there are quite a few funny memes or videos on the internet that make light of shareholder value. I remember one reading, there is a guy with his face in his hands and he's exasperated, and the line reads, "I just remembered that I'm not currently contributing to shareholder value." I mean, it never happens like that, right? An employee doesn't really do that. So, or on a cap, ever since I was little, I wanted to maximize shareholder value.
I don't think anyone goes home at night and says, I created a lot of shareholder value today. I bet they're pleased.
You bet. And you also write about these acronyms, which I found was interesting. You talk about how, let's say, even sophisticated investors, they examine return on capital employed, or ROCE. And you argue that, well, the returns often have no more connection to capital employed than it has to the amount of water used or the number of meetings held. Can you explain that piece, please?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And successful companies add value by doing things that other people can't do as well. And that isn't the same thing as a return on capital. Obviously, companies that work and survive and thrive, these companies have to make profits. Shareholder value isn't irrelevant, but maximizing shareholder value is not what great companies do. And another example, which I use in the book and find myself talking about over and over again now, is Boeing. And Boeing, in the second half of the 20th century, made itself the world's leading producer of civil aircraft. And they produced the 737, which is the workhorse, the short-haul jet of every airline around the world, and the 747, which made intercontinental air travel possible for lots of people who never imagined being able to do that before. And they helped build a great aviation industry around that. And the story of Boeing is that at the end of the 20th century, they took over McDonnell Douglas, who were their largest US rival, but less successful rival. And although it was a takeover by Boeing legally, culturally, it was a takeover by McDonnell Douglas. And McDonnell Douglas had a group of people who believed in the mantra of shareholder value. And the CEO, I think it was Phil Condit, who was one of the first CEOs after that, who said, people say this is a great engineering company. It is a great engineering company, he said, but people invest in a company because they want to make money. And that was his philosophy. Boeing actually recruited as a successor to him a man called Jim McNerney, who'd actually been a protege of Jack Welch's at General Electric in the US, but he missed out on the succession to Jack Welch. So he joined Boeing, and it was particularly important was that Boeing needed to compete with the Airbus 320, which is the competitive short-haul jet that is now has now become the best-selling plane in the world in aviation. And they decided under McNerney not to compete by designing a new model to replace the 737, which began in the 1960s, so it's now more than 50 years old, not to replace the 737 with another new model, but to redesign the 737 to accommodate more modern engines. And of course, that was the plane that crashed in 2018, 2019, and pretty much took Boeing's reputation and the stock price down with it. I remember getting in a Boeing plane not long after that and seeing someone sitting next to me saying, I see it's a Boeing plane. Is this the one that crashes?
That's the last thing you would like to hear on an airplane, isn't it?
Yes.
And these days, I've heard that on websites where you have to book tickets, one of the filters is Boeing or Airbus, because
Right.
people would like to know whether they're flying a Boeing or not, because they had taken a big hit to the reputation after the back-to-back disasters that had happened. Yeah.
Yes. So the Airbus 320 has now replaced the 737 as the world's best-selling plane.
And if these traditional financial indicators like return on capital employed or return on equity, if they don't cut mustard, then what are those metrics that investors or businessmen should use to gauge corporate health? Are we doing well? Are we not? What do you recommend?
Now, the important point there is that there isn't a single metric, that you need to look at lots of aspects
Huh.
of the corporation. And you need to see, are the customers happy with the product? Or are they asking, is this a Boeing or an Airbus? You have to have a workforce that is proud of what they do. And that was really very important to Boeing, and something that deteriorated quite rapidly in the regime which we're just describing. Is the company well regarded in the communities of which it formed part? One of the extraordinary things that happened in the Condit era at Boeing was they put the location of the company headquarters up for auction, in effect. And Chicago won it. And there was an almost unbelievable day when apparently the non-execs of Boeing turned up at the Boeing field at Seattle to get in a plane which was going to take them to the new head office. And they didn't know where it was going until it took off. And they said, we're on our way to Chicago.
Interesting. I mean, these companies over time, have you come across any outfits that have realized that, okay, we've strayed and we have probably lost our way by focusing just on making money, but they've corrected themselves? Of course, you have the likes of Bear Stearns that you write about in the book, that our main job is to make money, and you know where it went during the financial crisis. But are there those who said, oh, okay, we've made a mistake, let's come back to our roots and get on with it?
I think there are a lot of particularly fast-moving consumer goods companies. Companies like Unilever would be a good British example. Procter & Gamble, similarly in the US, of companies that are real. And because they're in these consumer markets, they realize that being close to their customers and maintaining a reputation for delivering what it is that customers want is critical to their long-run success.
And to the point of jargons and people using these acronyms, what is throughout your career, you've argued to make things simple. You celebrate simplicity. So, is there any piece of corporate conventional wisdom that you secretly wish which should never be uttered again, and that exasperates you when people talk about it?
I think it's the emphasis on making the numbers. The quarterly earnings report. You mentioned the UK equity market report right at the beginning. And a large part of that for me was companies that are obsessed with meeting market expectations of what their next quarter earnings are going to be.
Right.
Quite a number of companies dropped that and have realized that that kind of metric is not a sensible way of running a great business.
And moving on from companies to countries, you also have a section in your book where you try and talk about how to measure GDP, or what is it that we get wrong when we are trying to do that. It's an impossible task in the first place to understand what the economic output of a country is. What do we do right now to get to that outcome? And where is it that you think we could do better?
It's interesting. I mean, we devote so much effort both to promoting GDP and to talking about it. And I think it's so far from being really what we want to measure. And what has happened is, I think part of the reason here is that the measurement of GDP and all the basis of national income accounting was developed during the Second World War. And you want to know how many tanks and aircraft are coming off the production line at the end of the day. Interestingly, you're not that interested in whether they're depreciation. You want to see how many planes you've got in the sky, which is part of this oddity that we measure GDP, gross domestic product, not net domestic product. So investment is in effect counted twice. And that, I think, is the Second World War origin. But if it's the number of cars and tanks and planes that are coming off the production line, or it's the number of cars that are coming off the production line, it's easy to measure that. If I walk around London now, and I'm sure it's the same in Mumbai or Kolkata, I keep bumping into people who are busy working on their mobile phones. And I ask, how is this reflected in national income accounts? And the answer is not very well. You know, I can now order a taxi, not by going out into the street in the rain and waving my hand, but by pressing a button on my phone. Where is that? Now we make some attempts to measure that with things that are called hedonic prices, but very little of that, and it doesn't really go very far. I was very struck. There's a quite famous paper by Bill Nordhaus in which he measures the price of light over time. And the price of light varies from cavemen who actually painted in their caves by collecting firewood, and fire was the only method of light. And we gradually improved that till people used candles and wax and then electricity. What's remarkable, I think, is that Nordhaus wrote that paper about the price of light over time back in the late 1990s. And since then, the price of light has fallen by another 80% or so because we're now using much more efficient light bulbs, principally, than we did then. We also make electricity in more efficient ways, and so on, so on. The resources that we need in order to produce that simple commodity light have declined very rapidly, and yet our measurement of GDP doesn't really reflect that. We need to think a lot more carefully about what we're doing there.
And would there be an alternative? As I understand from you, is we are still stuck in older ways to measure economic output. Times have changed. You can hail a cab, or I can even get garlic cloves in India, in Mumbai, in 7 minutes time when I'm cooking fish, for example. It's as because the godowns are right next door.
Yeah.
I'm sure the same in the UK or the U. So are these the also be part of the equation that calculates GDP, and are they not already?
They are to a little bit. People calculate what they call hedonic prices, by which your computer improves every year. And you try and measure that by seeing how much people are willing to pay for the improvements, because you have last year's model and this year's model on sale at the same time. How much more are people willing to pay for the new model than the old model? If you look at all of that, you can get some sort of clue as to what is going on in terms of these improvements. But that's only done to a very limited extent, and it's actually very difficult to do. I remember I first got involved myself in trying to measure hedonic prices quite a long time ago when I sat down to measure hedonic prices for cars. So you did a big regression in which you had the specifications of cars and the price of cars, and you could price all the attributes of a car.
Hmm.
I started to realize this was not so easy when, I don't know if you remember, there used to be a car called the Citroën de Chevaux, which was a very basic French car driven by French peasants. And I discovered that my equation said that given its specifications, it ought to sell for a negative price, but it didn't. It sold quite well to French peasants for a decent price. You
Right.
couldn't get it all in the regression.
And the funny thing, what I read, and you being an economist can perhaps attest to it, is if you put five economists in a room, they will always have five different ways to get to the same. Isn't it a social science, or because it's not really? You need to put in certain assumptions to get to the final outcome or output. So there is a lot of disagreement among economists as well when it comes to these big subjects, isn't there?
There is some disagreement, but I think we need to be careful about this. Economics is a social science,
Hmm.
and we want to make it a science, but it's never going to be a science in the way that physics is, and we discover physical laws, and you would be stupid to use any other model other than Newton's law of
Right.
gravity, for example. There will never be models of that kind. Models in economics are immensely useful. I've spent much of my life building models, but they're useful as ways of thinking, not as things that give you numeric. So the idea that we're going to have an economic model that will give us predictions of what output will be in 5 years' time
Hmm.
is just ridiculous. That kind of model doesn't exist and can't exist.
And if a country is in recession, as I understand it, it says when you have two back to back quarters of negative growth, which also means that you get to learn about the recession a good 60 days after it has hit you, because the data also needs to add up until then, isn't there? So it's difficult to gauge the health in real time as well.
Yeah. On the other hand, what a recession is not really when something happens to GDP figures, and you know what's happening rather better in the
Huh.
economy by going around talking to business people and getting a sense of what's happening in your economy there. All these measurements are very difficult and can be done in many different ways, but let's emphasize that's not a reason for not doing them. It's a reason for not believing that we get, as it were, the right answer to a question in a way that plausibly we often do in physics and other sciences.
Right. I think another example that comes to mind is that of unpaid work, where let's say I remember a stand-up comedian. I like him very much, Bill Burr, and he makes light of it in the context that he's talking to his girlfriend. He says about being a mom is the hardest job in the world, is what he and his girlfriend are watching Oprah Winfrey show, and that's what Oprah says. And he says, really, I mean, is that the most difficult job in the world, or would you rather be drilling in the center of the earth and shaking hands with the devil when you're laying those cables, and every time there is a rumble in the ground and you wait for the thing to collapse on you? Is that difficult, or is it difficult to be up in the sunshine with a couple of toddlers and sending them to bed anytime you want? Anything that you can do in your pair of pajamas is not difficult, he says. Now, obviously, it's to bring out a laugh, but how can you measure a mom's work or a homemaker's work, which probably is unpaid, obviously?
Yeah. Um, and the answer is we're not really trying when we measure GDP. We're trying to measure
Hmm.
economic output. And that, to my mind, makes sense. But we shouldn't confuse that with measuring welfare. I go back to my example that these methods were developed during the Second World War. You
Hmm.
really wanted to know how much stuff you could throw at the enemy, and however useful a mom's work was, it wasn't directly useful in that.
Hmm.
We need to be thoughtful about what these things measure. When you talk there about what you can do in your pajamas, I'm struck, I think I use it in the book, the quote from during the COVID from someone who was in the UK in one of the centres where manufacturing activity has declined, much of it, as you know, having gone to Asia, and saying it's not a real job if you can do it in your pajamas. And that's a comment on Zoom. And what is really a manufacturing fetish that people have, unless it's a physical thing, it's not a real job. And of course, in our Western economies, most people are now employed in service activities. And of course, a lot of that kind of service activity itself is now being outsourced to places like India.
India. But manufacturing is still considered to be one of those metrics by which industrial output, for example, even in India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi talks about make in India, and that manufacturing is still the bedrock. We shouldn't forget it. Yes, services are there, but the share of manufacturing to the GDP in terms of contribution, does it go down eventually as the country progresses? And is that a cliche, or that's textbook?
It goes down, and it should go down. I illustrate this often by showing what the iPhone, in effect, replaces. That the iPhone doesn't do anything, really, that we couldn't do before. We had phones, we had messaging services, we had atlases, we had libraries, we had all these things. But now we do them in one little thing that fits in our pocket. And that's the kind of progress that has been made. And that's actually replacing the physical manual effort that went into traditional manufacturing with the mental effort that goes into modern products. But what I call manufacturing fetishism, that it's all really about manufacturing and everything else is kind of frivolous, that it's not a real job if you can do it in your pajamas. That kind of attitude goes very deeply. And it's also, I think, very gendered. The real jobs in these things are all the things that were traditionally done by men. And the caring activities in which women played a much larger part are regarded as secondary. But they're not secondary. We need them. And I can outsource programming to India. I can't outsource looking after my mother to India.
Yeah. And in the recent past, you talked about from World War II and how do we measure the GDP. But more recently, since 2022, suddenly artificial intelligence was no longer a preserve of the techies or geeks. It came down to us, like regular people could use it, and things have changed incredibly. How do you see AI, in the whole mix? Has it shaken things up? How do we measure its contribution?
I think a lot of the time I've seen this before. I take myself back to 1999, 2000, and people were talking about the impact of the internet. And the economic impact of the internet was and has been huge, but people hugely overestimated the short-term effect. And most of the dot-com companies of 1999, most of them disappeared. It's made a large difference to business and the way we do it, but that's taken 25 years, not 25 months. And I think the same will be true of the ways in which we use artificial intelligence. And we've been talking earlier about the kind of service activities that can be outsourced. Where I think artificial intelligence will make a big difference is really in low-skilled, white-collar jobs, things like legal documents, conveyancing, all that sort of contract formation. We're not going to run our businesses with AI in the imaginable future.
Back in 1999, after the dot-com bubble, do you think the techies would have learned something from that experience? It was all hype and little value, where they were selling pet products online, where it cost more to deliver the stuff than the product itself. But today there is a lot of promise along with the hype. And like, for example, I'll give you a small example. This podcast would take me about 3 to 4 hours to edit 3 years ago, but today it takes me 40 minutes because it transcribes everything that you and I have spoken. I merely edit the words and the video gets edited by itself, which when I first discovered, I said, wow, it's 2 hours less for me to do drudgery work. And going forward, Sir John, it also can The promise is, can you please extract the most interesting segments and make short YouTube videos so that people will hear more of your comments. Now it's using intelligence that a human being would, and probably do it even better. Isn't that a little scary, or is that evolution?
I think that's evolution. I don't find it scary in the way you seem to. And if AI was really good at picking out the interesting bits, I would be more impressed by that. I think AI probably is not even good at picking out if it picks out the less familiar bits,
Hmm.
may pick out some of the original bits. It may also pick out a lot of the bits that are just plain wrong, as we all know AI does frequently.
Yes, these are still early days in that section. It hasn't really cracked that yet. I still have to create those 3-minute segments. But the way things are going, I won't be surprised in the next 6 months to a year, they will be able to crack it. But again, it's more like one school of thought is it's the average. AI brings to fore whatever is the average chatter around. I'm not sure what quality it might be, but it still has made a difference. Last few questions, Sir John, is over the years, since the time you were a student at school, which thinkers or people have shaped your thinking, especially those, let's say, outside economics?
It's an interesting question, and it goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about the light bulbs that went off for me. I talked there about morality and ethics, business, and there was a book by Bob Solomon, as I described, at the University of Texas. What's ridiculous about that, actually, is that the person who did most to redevelop and rehabilitate Aristotle and Aristotle's virtue ethics was a woman called Elizabeth Anscombe, who was actually in Oxford, a couple of 100 yards from where I was teaching economics at St. John's. But the idea that I, as an economist, had anything to learn from a philosopher across the road at a women's college was not in my mind at all then. But actually, that kind of thinking has made a huge impact on me. It's funny, the book which I've been most impressed by, in a sense, in the last 5 to 10 years, is Joe Henrich's book, which is called The Secret of Our Success. And it's the way in which economic growth, or what I would describe as economic growth and development, has occurred as a result of the growth of collective knowledge meaning the accumulation of stuff that we find in Wikipedia. And then in business, the creation of the intercollective intelligence, the problem-solving capabilities that are based on that kind of collective knowledge. And it's the idea of that process as being behind our technological advance and economic progress, which has made a lot of difference to the way in which I think about economics. As you're implying, I think we can often learn a great deal about, as economists, about our subject of economics by reading things that aren't economics at all.
Yes, and you also quoted To Kill a Mockingbird, so you would have read widely.
Yes.
Yes, and can you take us through the day when you got the call? I don't know how it works. Can you describe to be knighted, and that, hey, you have been considered and you would have to go to the Buckingham Palace? Could you take me through how did?
The knighthood is simply a letter that comes through your door that says, Majesty has the Queen there, has it in mind, and would you accept? Well, actually, you can't refuse Her Majesty's command, I think. But I don't know how you would refuse it, and because some people do, but I certainly didn't. And and then you, having replied affirmatively to Her Majesty's request, you were then told you turn up at Buckingham Palace on some date or other, and you will get the knighthood. And of course, it was slightly strange for me because it actually happened during the COVID pandemic. So one effect of that was you were only allowed to take one person with you to Buckingham Palace, which, when I thought of it, fortunate isn't the right word, but my parents were no longer alive because they would both desperately, like it would have been the greatest moment of their lives.
Yeah.
So it was obvious I had to take my wife. But also, it was a rather strange ceremony. You were just in the room with, it was actually Prince William who
Hmm.
conferred the knight on me, because our queen was then getting well on in years and deteriorating in health. So it was Prince William that did it, but it was a very pleasant occasion. We had a chat about a 33-minute chat about the economy.
And you had a chat with Prince William. Did he have anything interesting to say at all?
I wouldn't have said he'd had anything. I'd have been startled if he'd had anything novel to say about the economy.
Yes, and one final thing, Sir John, you briefly mentioned about your parents. Are there any lessons that you learned from your parents growing up that you still hold dear even today?
I think, well, I think my father came from a small village in Scotland, and an interesting part of his story. There's a story my uncle tells of be, told of it being out. My uncle was being taken down the street in the village with my grandmother, and someone came up and pointed to my uncle and said, "Is he the clever one?" To which, of course, my grandmother said, "No, it was my father who was the clever one." But actually, my grandfather on the parental side died really quite young. And it was only much later in life that I discovered that what had happened to my father was some people from that village had emigrated to the US. Quite a lot of people from rural Scotland emigrated to the US. And they'd made good in the US and had set up a fund to support the village. And it was that fund that sent my father to a good school and then on to university. And that's how I got to be where I am in Edinburgh. But then I went to school in Edinburgh, and the school I went to, it was actually the best selective state school in Edinburgh. And if I think back on that, the classmates of my time were extraordinary. There was Ian Charleson, who was a star of an Oscar winning film, Chariots of Fire. In fact, I remember another role he played was he was the Scottish minister who accompanied Gandhi when he went
Hmm.
everywhere in the film of Gandhi. He stars in that. And also Robin Cook, who became a Labour MP and Foreign Secretary. And so I think I got an enormous amount of that in terms of learning how to debate with Robin, learning how to act with Ian. And these things have stood me in good stead, I think, throughout my life. I was very lucky in terms of the school. And I'd only have done better if I'd gone to some of the really posh private schools like Eton in terms of the contemporaries whom I had.
And from in terms of values that they brought you up with, are there any? You talked about honesty is the best policy. You don't have to advertise that, but
Yes.
on a serious note, though, as a kid, what a couple of values that your parents said you should always remember this, and you continue to abide by those. Say,
You know, the honesty and the hard work and the mathematical side of that has been, the story of Scottish economic development, really from 1700 to 1900. It's largely neglected because it's one of the great stories of economic development that there ever has been. That this poor peripheral country on the outskirts of Europe became one of the richest parts of the world by 1900. A lot of that, bluntly, significant part of that was looting India, which we should not feel very proud of. But in terms of the positives of the British Empire, a lot of them came from Scotland as well. That kind of what people have called the Protestant ethic about hard work and integrity within that, I think one got that from being brought up and educated in Scotland, and that has been very valuable to me.
excellent. Thank you very much, Sir John, for your time on this podcast, and many, many congratulations on yet another book. I just want to ask you, how do you, when you write books like these, and you've written quite a few, do you sit down in the morning? Are you a morning person, night person? Do you write your first drafts very fast? Do you agonize on editing today with the experience that you
I
have?
do a lot of agonizing on editing, but I don't sit down and say, now I'm going to write another 500 words.
Right.
I do enjoy taking long walks and thinking things through and them. And very often, as a result of that, I can come back and I was going to say pick up a pen, but now it's pick up a computer and get on with it.
Did you write your first book with a pen? Do you recall the
Yes.
first?
Yes.
We did. I don't think there is this generation. That generation is lost.
You know what to do with a pen, yes.
How was that experience? Can you recall your first book when you literally sat down with a piece of paper and pen and going through it?
Indeed. And I'm trying to think when the shift to a computer, because even after things became digitized, there was still an element of writing things down and then an assistant put it into a computer. I think there are still some people who do that. I can even remember the days when I would handwrite something, and send it by fax to be typed up.
Do you miss those days, or do you enjoy this one better, this
No,
option better?
I enjoy this, and being able to, the ease with which you can shift things around in the modern world. Well, the two big things. One is the ease with which you can shift things around. The other is the things that are kind of at the back of your mind. I mean, a
Right.
good example would be Atticus Finch quote we mentioned earlier. It might have been the case 25 years ago that one would have thought of that. And then, where was it? Was it Harper Lee or was it someone else? And either I or someone else would have to spend half a day in a library to check that out. Now, a couple of keys, you can get it as it was written by Harper Lee.
Indeed. Sir John, thank you so much for your time yet again. I look forward to releasing this, and all the best with your next book, whenever it is that you start thinking about it on your long walks.
Good. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.